Hey everyone, welcome back to Ancient Greeks podcast. I'm Eleanor.
And I'm August. I think we're on season 4 and we're presenting about the transatlantic slave trade.
And I'm Sarah. Well, let's get started.
So, what was the transatlantic slave trade, August?
So, the basic origins of the slave trade is when Portugal and Spain expanded globally. They expected for Asia, yet landed in west ports of Africa. Doing that, they captured slaves and transported them across the Americas.
What were the countries involved?
So, there are lots of European countries that are involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but mainly Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark. They mainly involved in the slave trade.
Yeah, Britain had a lot of important figures in the slave trade. For example, we have William Wilberforce. He is a parliamentary leader from the 1780s. He started an anti-slavery campaign after converting to Christianity. He also culminated in the passing of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which abolished the slave trade in the British Empire at the time.
There was also William Pitt, played by Benedict Cumberbatch in the movie Amazing Grace. He was the former Prime Minister of the UK and a strong advocate for abolishing the slave trade in his early career. He delivered powerful speeches and encouraged parliamentary action. Also, Thomas Clarkson, an English abolitionist and a leading campaigner against the slave trade, he wrote a book called the Clarkson Pamphlet, and he collected facts at ports around Britain to help Wilberforce abolish the slave trade.
So, what are the countries involved in it? Most of the European countries took part in the slave trade by capturing slaves from America and trade them. Until January 1808, a new federal law made it illegal to import captive people from America into the U.S.
From Africa into the U.S.? That's interesting.
So Portugal was a really big participant in this trade. Their ships in the 1480s started around, it started longer than the transatlantic slave trade. So in the 1480s, they would transport enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations in Cape Verde and the Madeira Islands, which is in the eastern Atlantic.
In the 1400s as well, specifically in 1444, the Portuguese marauders attempted to assault and capture the Senegalese using armor, swords, and deep-sea vessels, but they failed.
This was because the Senegalese had poisonous arrows that seeped through the Portuguese armor, which decimated their army by a lot. And this resulted in the Portuguese stopping the close combat situations. Over time, they resulted with a negotiation with African leaders to trade for slaves.
The British had many goals in the slave trade, and a few of them were to accumulate wealth in slaves and to outdo other powerful nations in any way possible. A new patent was issued to the Company of Royal Adventurers, which provided them with the opportunity and the necessary finances to ship slaves.
The British first entered the slave trade in 1555 when John Locke, an Englishman, brought the first 5 slaves to England. And Hawkins was second and was credited as the pioneer of the English slave trade, and his first journey was 1562.
And after 1663, the English became extremely involved in the slave trade. This was because the Company of Royal Adventurers received a lot of royal backing from King James II and the Duke of York. The Royal African Company was another trade company formed in 1672. They significantly aided the British by providing sales for labor, which they highly depended on for their economy.
In the 1600s, 1,200 slaves were transported to the Dominican Republic and Haiti, led by John Hawkins. And in 1698, the major ports used in the British slave trade were Bristol and Liverpool, because of the abolition of the monopoly of trade between Africa and Britain. The cities traded and therefore gained great wealth because of it.
Yeah.
For example, in 1713, Britain made a deal with Spain to supply them with 4,800 slaves a year for 30 years.
And researchers argue and debate that the British gained wealth and that the slave trade actually brought forth and sped up the Industrial Revolution with all that income from slavery. However, some critics also argue that the British gained very little wealth and that the slave trade had a very little impact on Britain's economy.
So, what were the living conditions for slaves?
So, how did the slave live as transported while? So, in human conditions, in the bottom of like a loaded ship with no area, like very small spaces, and then privacy for bathrooms, sleeping quarters, or any positive quality of life in general.
So, it was really inhumane.
Yeah. Like historians estimate that 12.5 million Africans were forced aboard slave ships, but only 10.7 million survived from the Middle Passage. This means around 15% died during the journey, and some on voyages. The death rate was even higher for that. The causes of death included disease, starvation, dehydration, abuse, and the horrific conditions in which the enslaved people were chained below deck.
What were the conditions of the ships?
So, survival meant enduring weeks or even months, packed tightly into hot, dark, like unventilated holds, and people were like chained wrist to ankle, like they were not unable to move. The lack of sanitation led to widespread disease like dysentery, smallpox, and
Measles?
And many captives were also physically assaulted, tortured, or forced to endure punishments designed to prevent rebellion.
And the slaves' lives in the Americas weren't that good either. They worked on plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil. Enslaved people often work in sugar production, one of the most brutal labor systems. Days ran from sunrise to sunset, and during sugar harvest seasons, days of work could last to 18 hours straight.
In North America, they worked in tobacco, cotton, and rice fields, or as blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, and even house servants. No matter the job, enslaved people faced constant exhaustion, violence, and the threat of being sold away from their families.
So, violence and control. The enslavers used physical punishment, like psychological intimidation, and legal restrictions to maintain the control. The enslaved people were considered property, meaning that they could be bitten, branded, or whipped without legal consequences. Families could be separated at any moment, and enslaved people had almost no protection under the law.
So these people weren't treated like humans at all.
For like their silent resistance, most common forms of their resistance, like it wasn't any dramatic battle or protest. They were small everyday acts that challenged the authority of their enslavers. So enslaved workers would break their tools, slow their work, or like faked illnesses to disrupt plantation productivity. People would practice African languages, music, and spiritual traditions in secret to keep their identity alive. And some of them even stole food to survive, freed others from chains, or taught each other to read despite the laws banning literacy among slaves.
So, how did this affect Africa? It caused major population loss. Millions of young, healthy Africans, the people most capable working, those were the ones that were taken to the Americas. But some of the regions in Africa lost 1/3 to 1/2 of their population, weakening societies for generations. There was also political destabilization, and so European traders fueled wars between African kingdoms by exchanging guns for captives, and this encouraged major violence, raiding, and political chaos. Many stable societies collapsed or became dependent on the slave trade for survival.
And the economic damage in Africa was like, instead of developing local industries or trade systems, many regions became tied to capturing and selling people. This stunted economic growth and left long-term instability that some African nations are still recovering from today. And the cultural impacts are like the entire families, ethnic groups, and cultural lines were disrupted. Languages, traditions, and identities were scattered across continents, creating a global African diaspora. And racial
Hierarchies and discrimination.
discriminations. Like, to justify slavery, Europeans created racial ideologies claiming Africans were inferior. These ideas didn't like disappear with abolition. They evolved into segregation, colorism, police violence, and systemic racism still present today.
This affects other nations too, but mainly Africa. They experienced a major population decline in the West. Europe also traded weaponry with Africa, which changed how they did warfare. In the Americas, the diseases were spread, but the slaves allowed for agriculture to be maintained and new infrastructure to be built.
Yeah, the slaves also helped a lot of the economy in the Americas and all around. Yeah. Because there was high demand for a lot of things, and having slave labor was just really convenient.
Yeah.
So, influence and aftermath. The formation of multiracial societies. That was one of the consequences of the slave trade. Because millions of Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic, the Americas became some of the most culturally blended regions on Earth. African traditions mixed with European and indigenous cultures to create new languages, religions, food, and music that define the Americas today.
And for social and political tensions, like the aftermath of the slave trade led to segregation, civil wars, and independence movements. The fight for equality from Haiti's independence to the US civil rights movement, they cannot be separated from the legacy of slavery.
What legacy does event leave? So first of all, legacy of inequality. Communities like descended from enslaved people still face higher levels of poverty, discrimination, and limited access to education, healthcare, and political power. And these inequalities didn't appear randomly. They are the direct result of centuries of forced labor and racial law.
Yeah, there's also a really big legacy of resistance and resilience, such as enslaved people, they resisted in countless ways, and their descendants continue that legacy today, such as modern movements for civil rights, Black empowerment, and racial justice across the world. It traces the roots back to the courage of those who fought against slavery.
Now we come back to the true definition of abolition. What does abolition truly mean? And that to those people would mean ridding of the slave trade. It meant abolition started with the rationalist thinkers arguing about rights of man. And in the late 18th century, abolitionists began to fight for the prohibition of slave shipments entering Britain and Americas. They prohibited the import of slaves finally in 1807, but unfortunately, people continued to smuggle in 1862. And I think that's where the slave trade ends for real.
That's the timeline of it for now. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Shout out to Jacob for
Yeah.
recording.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the Ancient Cooks podcast. We'll see you next time.